Hey, what's going on everyone? Brandon here from TruckSafe Consulting. In this video, we're going to kick off a series of videos dedicated to the FMCSA's Safety Measurement System, or SMS for short, to explore how that system is used by the agency to prioritize motor carriers for enforcement. In particular, we're going to walk through each of the 7 scored categories contained within SMS, known as the basics, and discuss exactly how a carrier's scores are calculated. Our hope is that by shedding some light in this admittedly confusing area, carriers will have a better understanding and handle on their safety-related data and can take the steps necessary to improve their scores over time. Now, before we dive right into each of the basics, we should start with a high-level look at the safety measurement system and how it fits within the FMCSA's broader enforcement program. So stay tuned, and if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay up to date on all of our new DOT-related content. So since 2010, the FMCSA has used its Compliance Safety Accountability, or CSA system to prioritize federally regulated motor carriers for enforcement action. The safety measurement system is one major component of CSA, which ranks carriers against their peers in 7 categories known as the basics. Now, technically, CSA is the broader program that encompasses not only SMS, but also other types of enforcement action, including compliance reviews. However, over the years, the terms CSA and SMS have been used interchangeably to describe a carrier's SMS scores. Now, these scores are primarily a function of the number, type, and severity of regulatory violations uncovered during roadside inspections and/or compliance reviews. Carriers that perform worse than a certain percentage of their peers in the basic categories are placed higher on the FMCSA's prioritization list and are more likely to receive warning letters, fines, and compliance reviews. For this reason, and because poor SMS scores can also lead to increased insurance premiums and loss of business, it's imperative that carriers understand how their scores are calculated and consistently monitor and work to improve them. So that's what we're going to cover in this series of video lessons, how each of the individual basics are scored. But before we get there, it's important to first understand some of the terminology and general concepts that go into the SMS system, which we'll address in this first video before diving into the individual basics. As a preliminary matter, what exactly are the basics? Well, the FMCSA assesses motor carrier on-road performance and compliance by grouping investigation and inspection results into 7 categories, known as the Behavior Analysis and Safety Improvement categories, or basics for short. Carriers are scored in each of the 7 basics, which results in what we know as CSA or SMS scores. The 7 basics are as follows. First up, unsafe driving, which pertains to the operation of commercial motor vehicles by drivers in a dangerous or careless manner. Examples include speeding, reckless driving, improper lane change, and inattention. Next up, we have crash indicator, which considers histories or patterns of high crash involvement, such as frequency and severity. It's based on information from state-reported crashes that meet reportable crash standards. For example, fatalities, injuries requiring medical attention away from the scene, and disabling damage requiring a vehicle to be towed. Then we have hours of service compliance, which includes violations of the regulations pertaining to records of duty status and hours of service limits. Examples include a driver operating more hours than allowed under the HOS regulations and falsification of records of duty status. Next, we have vehicle maintenance, which pertains to regulations regarding properly maintaining a CMV and preventing shifting loads, spilled or dropped cargo, and overloading a CMV. Examples include operating an out-of-service vehicle, improper loading or securement, or operating a vehicle with inoperative brakes, lights, or other mechanical defects. Then we have controlled substances and alcohol, which pertains to operating a CMV by drivers who are impaired due to alcohol, illegal drugs, and the misuse of prescription or over-the-counter medications. Examples include operating under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Next up is hazardous materials compliance, which addresses the requirements in Part 397 of the Federal Safety Regulations, as well as those in the hazardous material regulations. Examples include failing to mark, label, or placard in accordance with the regulations and not properly securing a package containing hazmat. And lastly, we have driver fitness, which concerns the operation of commercial motor vehicles by drivers who are unfit to operate a CMV due to a lack of training, experience, or medical qualifications. Examples include failing to have a valid and appropriate commercial driver's license and being medically unqualified to operate a CMV. So those are the 7 scored basics. The next important point to understand is that every conceivable safety-related violation is assigned to one of these basics. Now, as you might imagine, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of ways a motor carrier and its drivers might run afoul of the safety regulations. Everything from burned out headlights all the way up to operating under the influence. For purposes of scoring carriers in each of the 7 basics, the FMCSA has assigned each and every conceivable violation to one of those basics. Now, as a general rule, these are safety-related violations only, meaning that registration-type violations, for example, won't impact a carrier's scores. Now, each violation assignment is listed in a chart in the FMCSA's SMS methodology, a nearly 200-page document that's available on the agency's website. The next important point in understanding SMS is that each of these individual violations carries a severity weight, which reflects the FMCSA's assessment of each violation's association with crash occurrence and crash consequences. Severity weights are on a scale from 1 to 10 for each basic, where 1 represents the lowest crash risk and 10 represents the highest crash risk relative to the other violations in the basic. Additionally, violations in certain basics that result in the driver or vehicle being placed out of service will carry an extra severity weight. For example, the violation's normal severity weight plus 2 additional points for an out of service violation. Now, as we'll discuss in subsequent videos in this series, each basic is scored slightly differently. However, generally speaking, each carrier is assigned an absolute measure score in each basic each month, based on the violations it incurred in those basics over the past 24 months. This absolute measure score is generally a function of each violation's severity and time weight. Now, in terms of time, each violation is assigned a weight based on how recently it occurred. Violations occurring within the last 6 months carry a time weight of 3. Those occurring between 6 and 12 months ago carry a time weight of 2. And those occurring between 12 and 24 months ago carry a time weight of 1. Violations occurring beyond 24 months do not impact a carrier's score at all. A carrier's absolute measure score in the vehicle maintenance basic, for example, is calculated by multiplying each violation's severity weight by its time weight to get a total weight, and then adding the total weight for all violations, and then dividing that sum by the time weight for all of the violations. Now, some of the other basics factor in additional information besides severity and time, such as the average number of power units that the carrier has operated over a certain time frame, which we'll discuss in later videos. Importantly, a carrier's absolute measure score is not itself what we know as a CSA or SMS score. The absolute measure score has to be compared against other motor carriers with similar operating characteristics to arrive at a percentile score, which is generally understood as the carrier's CSA or SMS score. Now, consider this analogy. When my young son goes in for an annual checkup, the nurse measures his weight and height and compares those measures against his peers. The report we receive lists his actual weight, for example, 26 pounds, and height, 33 inches, and also his percentile for weight, for example, 60%, and height, 53%. These percentiles tell us how he's growing relative to his peers, while his actual weight and height just tell us how he has progressed individually from the last report. In this sense, a carrier's absolute measure scores are akin to my son's actual height and weight, whereas its CSA scores are akin to his percentile measures. With that analogy in mind, a carrier's absolute measure score in a given month must be compared against those of its peers in order to arrive at a percentile CSA score. Now, obviously, it would be inherently unfair to compare the scores of a large motor carrier that has thousands of vehicles and corresponding violations against those of a single truck motor carrier that has virtually no data in the system. For this reason, another point to understand is that the SMS system normalizes data and places carriers in safety event groups based primarily on the number of inspections that they've incurred that have resulted in a violation in a particular basic. For example, let's say Carrier A and Carrier B have both incurred 25 roadside inspections in the past 24 months that resulted in violations in the vehicle maintenance basic. In all likelihood, those carriers would fall within the same safety event group for this basic, and their scores would be compared against one another and others in that same group to generate a percentile score. That in mind, CSA percentile scales are on a scale of 0 to 100, with 100 assigned to the worst performing carrier in the safety event group and 0 assigned to the best performing. Put differently, a carrier that has a score of 95% in the vehicle maintenance basic on a given month is performing worse than 95% of its peers in that category. Percentile scores are updated each month, and the system also has built-in data sufficiency thresholds so that carriers with very few inspections with violations in a particular category will not be scored in the category at all unless and until they incur a sufficient number of inspections with violations. For example, 5 inspections with violations over a 24-month period. And this is so that the system meaningfully analyzes and ranks their performance against their peers. The primary purpose of the CSA and SMS systems and these percentile scores is to prioritize carriers for enforcement action. With this in mind, the FMCSA has set intervention thresholds for each basic, and these thresholds are expressed in a percentile form. If a carrier CSA score exceeds an intervention threshold in a particular basic on a given month, the carrier score will show a warning triangle, and the carrier will be at an increased risk for intervention, which could include warning letters, safety audits, an increased number of inspections, or civil penalties. The intervention thresholds differ for each basic and are based upon whether the carrier hauls hazmat or passengers. For example, a general commodity hauler is subject to a 65% threshold in the unsafe driving, crash indicator, and hours of service basics, and an 80% threshold in the vehicle maintenance, drug and alcohol, driver fitness, and hazmat basics. So that's the FMCSA's SMS system in a nutshell. Obviously, the scoring is a bit complex, but from a high level, the scores are really just a function of the number, severity, and timing of violations incurred by a carrier in roadside inspections or safety audits. In the subsequent videos in this series, we'll spend some more time with each basic to get a better understanding of the various violations that factor into them and how each is scored so that you're equipped to take any actions that are necessary to improve those scores. In the meantime, if you're interested in more in-depth video lessons and comprehensive training courses on DOT regulations, be sure to check out our Truck Safe Academy, where we offer state-of-the-art courses for safety managers and for commercial drivers. And be sure to follow us on social media, where we regularly post compliance-related content. Thanks for watching.